David Grant, a tall, well-dressed black man in his late 30s, walked along the path, briefcase in hand. His expression was calm, eyes scanning the park as he made his way to meet his family for lunch. David had always liked this park. It was a small piece of tranquility in an otherwise chaotic city, a place to breathe and think. Today, he was lost in thought, looking forward to spending time with his wife and kids after a long week. Across the park, Officer Tim Mitchell stood watching, his hand resting on the handle of his baton. Tim had been patrolling this beat for years. He knew the area, knew the people, and in his mind, he could spot trouble from a mile away. But what caught his attention today was David, alone, carrying a briefcase, and walking with a certain confidence that made Tim uneasy. Tim's eyes narrowed as he watched David. A black man, dressed in a suit, walking through the park. He hadn't seen him around here before. And something about him just didn't sit right. His gut told him there was more to the story than just a man taking a walk. Too calm, Tim muttered under his breath. Too sure of himself. Without a second thought, Tim crossed the park, heading straight for David. As he got closer, his steps quickened, fueled by an unspoken suspicion that had nothing to do with David's behavior and everything to do with his own assumptions. David, feeling the weight of someone's gaze, looked up from his thoughts. He saw Tim approaching, an expression on his face that David recognized all too well. The officer's eyes were sharp, judgmental, and carried the same look of suspicion that David had faced countless times before. Tim stopped a few feet away from David, his hand still on his baton. "Afternoon," Tim said, his voice neutral, but there was an edge to it. David, keeping his face calm, nodded politely. "Afternoon." Tim's eyes flickered to the briefcase in David's hand. "What brings you out here today?" David met the officer's gaze evenly. "Just enjoying the park, meeting my family in a bit." But Tim wasn't satisfied with the answer. His suspicion deepened as he took a step closer. "You from around here?" David gave a slight smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I've been around." The non-answer only made Tim more uneasy. His grip tightened on his baton as he looked David up and down. Something about this man wasn't adding up in his mind, though he couldn't quite place it. The feeling gnawed at him, pushing him to act. "Mind if I see some ID?" Tim asked, his voice sharper now. David's smile faded. He knew this moment well. This was the point where things could go sideways. He wasn't required to show ID just for walking in the park, and refusing could escalate the situation. But David had been through this before, too many times. He knew how it worked. "Am I under arrest?" David asked, his voice calm, measured. Tim's expression hardened. He didn't like being questioned, especially not by someone who seemed so calm, so sure of himself. "You will be if you don't cooperate," Tim shot back, his hand inching toward his holster. David took a slow, steady breath. He could feel the tension building, but he wasn't going to back down. "I'm just sitting in a park. Is there a law against that?" Tim's patience was wearing thin. His suspicions, fueled by nothing more than David's presence, were starting to blind him. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," Tim said, though even he knew how flimsy the excuse sounded. David didn't move. He kept his gaze steady on the officer, refusing to give him the reaction he was clearly looking for. "And what description is that?" Tim's jaw tightened. He didn't have a real answer, but he wasn't going to let this man make him look foolish. "Don't get smart with me," Tim snapped. "Show me some ID now." David held his gaze for a moment longer, the tension between them thickening. He could push back, assert his rights, but he knew how that could play out. Reluctantly, he reached into his pocket, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his wallet. Tim snatched the ID from David's hand, his eyes scanning the name quickly. It didn't mean anything to him, but that didn't matter. He had already made up his mind. "Stand up," Tim ordered, stepping back to give David room. David sighed inwardly but did as he was told. He rose slowly from the bench, his hands visible at his sides. "Turn around," Tim said, pulling out his handcuffs. David felt a surge of frustration, but swallowed it down. He turned around, letting Tim cuff him without resistance. People in the park began to notice, their eyes on the scene unfolding, but no one intervened. As the cold metal cuffs clicked around his wrists, David remained calm, though inside, the familiar weariness crept in. He had been through this before, too many times, and he knew, once again, that despite everything he had achieved, in the eyes of people like Officer Mitchell, he was still just another black man who didn't belong. David sat quietly in the back of the police cruiser, his wrists still bound by the tight cuffs. The car's engine hummed softly as Officer Tim Mitchell drove through the busy city streets. David gazed out the window, watching as people went about their day, unaware of the injustice happening just a few feet away. His mind wasn't on the passing scenery, but on what would come next. He knew how this would unfold. He'd seen it before. Tim, gripping the wheel tightly, glanced at David in the rearview mirror. The unease that had settled in earlier hadn't left. David hadn't resisted, hadn't shown fear, hadn't acted like a man with something to hide. It made Tim question himself, but his pride refused to let him admit it. To him, something was still off about this man, and he was determined to prove it. "What were you really doing in that park?" Tim finally asked, his voice laced with suspicion. David's eyes didn't leave the window. His tone was calm, controlled. "I told you. I was just reading." Tim scoffed, his fingers drumming impatiently on the steering wheel. "A guy like you just sitting around reading? You expect me to believe that?" David turned his head slightly, raising an eyebrow at the comment. "A guy like me," he repeated, his voice even but with a quiet challenge beneath it. Tim hesitated, realizing his mistake. He hadn't meant to let that slip, but now the words were out there, hanging in the air between them. Instead of backing down, he doubled down. "You don't look like someone who spends his afternoons reading in the park," he said, trying to sound confident, but his words came out defensive. David didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, the weight of the officer's words settling in. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but firm. "And what does someone like me look like?" Tim didn't answer. He couldn't. He knew what he had been implying, knew how it sounded, but he wasn't about to admit it, not to David, and not to himself. Instead, he focused on driving, his frustration growing with every second of silence. He didn't like how this was turning out. He had expected a fight, a struggle, something to confirm his suspicions. But David's calmness only made him feel more unsure of his actions. As they pulled into the precinct parking lot, Tim parked the car and stepped out, moving quickly to open the back door. David got out slowly, feeling the cold metal of the cuffs dig into his wrists. The same weariness washed over him, the exhaustion of knowing that no matter what he did, no matter who he was always going to be judged first by the color of his skin. Tim led David into the precinct, past rows of desks where officers were busy with paperwork and phone calls. Some of the officers glanced up, curious about the arrest, but none of them questioned Tim. To them, it was just another arrest on another busy day. David, though, caught a few looks from some of the younger officers, something between discomfort and confusion, as if they sensed something wasn't right. At the booking desk, Officer Jenkins, a younger officer, looked up from his computer. He saw David in cuffs and raised an eyebrow at Tim. "What's this about?" Jenkins asked, his tone casual but with a hint of surprise. "Caught him acting suspicious in the park," Tim replied, his voice clipped. He handed over David's ID, avoiding Jenkins's gaze. Jenkins took the ID and scanned it. His eyes flicked between David and the screen as he entered the details into the system. But as soon as the results popped up, Jenkins froze, his eyes widened in recognition. He quickly masked his reaction, clearing his throat as he glanced at Tim. "Captain Bennett's in her office," Jenkins said, his voice suddenly more formal. "You might want to take him to her." Tim stiffened at the suggestion. Captain Laura Bennett was known for being strict but fair, a by-the-book leader who didn't tolerate any missteps. Tim hadn't planned on involving her in something as routine as this arrest, but Jenkins's tone told him there was more going on than he realized. Tim nodded, his voice tight. "All right, let's go." He grabbed David by the arm, leading him through the precinct halls toward Captain Bennett's office. As they walked, Tim's mind raced. Jenkins's reaction had unnerved him, but he pushed it down, convinced he hadn't made a mistake. Yet, there was a small knot of uncertainty forming in the pit of his stomach. When they reached Bennett's office, Tim knocked on the door. "Come in," came the sharp voice from inside. Tim opened the door and guided David into the room. Captain Bennett sat behind her desk, a stack of paperwork in front of her. She looked up from her files, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. "Officer Mitchell," she said, her tone neutral but with an edge. "What's this?" "Caught this guy in the park, acting suspicious," Tim explained, though his voice lacked the confidence it had before. He handed over David's ID. Bennett took the ID and glanced at it. Her expression didn't change, but there was a flicker in her eyes that told David she recognized his name. She looked up at David, then back at Tim before setting the ID down on her desk. "Officer Mitchell, why don't you step outside for a moment?" Bennett said, her voice calm but firm. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Grant alone." Tim blinked, caught off guard by the request. "But Captain—" "Outside, Mitchell," Bennett repeated, leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, Tim released David and stepped out of the office, closing the door behind him. As soon as he was gone, Captain Bennett's demeanor shifted. She leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes softening slightly. "Mr. Grant," she said, her voice measured, "I apologize for the misunderstanding." David allowed himself a small, tight smile. "No need to apologize, Captain. You're just doing your job." Bennett sighed, glancing at the door where Tim had just left. "I'm aware of who you are," she said, her voice lowering, "and I appreciate your patience. But why didn't you just tell Officer Mitchell who you are from the beginning?" David's smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. "Because it shouldn't matter, Captain. Who I am shouldn't be the reason I'm treated with respect." Bennett considered his words carefully, then nodded in understanding. "You're right. It shouldn't matter. But unfortunately, it does. To some people." The room fell into a brief silence, both of them considering the weight of the situation. Finally, Bennett stood up. "I'll call Officer Mitchell back in. We'll resolve this." David nodded, watching as Bennett moved to the door. The confrontation wasn't over, but the shift in power had already begun. The truth would come out soon enough, and Tim Mitchell would have to face the reality of what he had done. Tim Mitchell stood outside Captain Bennett's office, his heart racing. He couldn't shake the unease that had settled in ever since Jenkins had suggested taking David to see the captain. There was something off about this whole situation, something he wasn't being told. But pride kept him from admitting it to himself. The door to Bennett's office creaked open and Captain Bennett stepped out, her expression unreadable. "Officer Mitchell," she called, "come in." Tim straightened his posture and walked back into the office, trying to mask his growing anxiety. He glanced at David, who sat calmly in the chair, hands still cuffed, his expression unreadable. The calmness still unsettled Tim, but he pushed it aside, determined to maintain control. Bennett gestured for Tim to sit. He took a seat next to David, his eyes flicking between the captain and his suspect. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. "Officer Mitchell," Bennett began, her tone steady, "I'd like to ask you a few questions about this arrest." Tim swallowed, unsure where this was going, but determined to justify himself. "Of course, Captain," he replied, though his voice sounded less confident than before. "You said Mr. Grant was acting suspiciously in the park," Bennett said, keeping her eyes locked on him. "What exactly did you see that made you believe he was a threat?" Tim hesitated for a moment, trying to recall the exact reasons that had driven him to make the arrest. It all felt blurry now, his gut reaction, the way he had automatically assumed David didn't belong. "He was just sitting there alone," Tim began, though he immediately realized how weak it sounded. "And when I asked for ID, he was evasive." Bennett raised an eyebrow. "Evasive how?" Tim stammered, realizing how flimsy his reasoning was. "He didn't answer my questions right away. He seemed like he was hiding something." Bennett's eyes flicked to David, then back to Tim. "Did you have any reason to believe Mr. Grant was involved in a crime? Any actual evidence?" Tim felt the room closing in on him. His jaw tightened. "I was just following protocol, Captain," he said defensively. "He fit a description." "A description of what exactly?" Bennett pressed, her voice growing sharper. Tim opened his mouth to respond but stopped himself. He didn't have a good answer. There hadn't been any real description, no actual suspect that matched David's appearance. His gut had led him, but now he was realizing just how unfounded his instincts had been. His assumptions were laid bare, and they weren't based on anything concrete. David remained silent throughout the exchange, his eyes never leaving Tim. The calm, composed demeanor he had maintained from the start only heightened the tension. Captain Bennett stood up, folding her arms as she stared down at Tim. "Officer Mitchell, I'm going to ask you a direct question," she said firmly. "Did you arrest Mr. Grant because of any real suspicion, or did you arrest him because of the color of his skin?" The question hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. Tim's face paled. He wanted to deny it, to push back against the accusation, but the truth was gnawing at him. His pride refused to let him admit it, but deep down, he knew. He had let his bias guide him. "I was just doing my job," Tim muttered, his voice hollow. Bennett's gaze hardened. "No, Officer Mitchell, your job is to serve and protect, not to assume guilt based on appearances." The room fell silent. Tim felt the walls closing in, the reality of his mistake crashing down on him. But before he could say anything more, Bennett turned her attention to David. "Mr. Grant," she said, her tone softening, "I'm aware of who you are now. This should never have happened." Tim blinked, confused by the shift in tone. What did she mean, aware of who you are? He looked at David, his mind racing. Something was wrong. What had he missed? David slowly stood up, looking directly at Tim. His calmness had never wavered, but now there was an edge of authority in his voice. "You see, Officer Mitchell," David began, his voice steady and firm, "I'm not just some man sitting on a park bench." Tim's confusion deepened and his heart started to race faster. What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice shaky. David stepped closer, his eyes locking onto Tim's with a quiet intensity. "I'm a special agent with the FBI." Tim's world seemed to tilt on its axis. For a moment he couldn't speak, couldn't move. The words echoed in his head, each one hitting him like a sledgehammer. "FBI," he stammered, disbelief washing over him. David nodded, his face calm, but his eyes were sharp. "I was there in the park on my day off, just like any other citizen. I wasn't doing anything wrong. But you didn't see that, did you? You only saw the color of my skin." Tim's throat tightened. His mind raced back to the moment in the park, the assumptions he had made, the suspicion that had crept into his mind for no reason other than David's appearance. He hadn't just made a mistake. He had profiled an FBI agent, and now it was all coming back to haunt him. Bennett cleared her throat, breaking the heavy silence. "Mr. Grant is one of the top agents in the Bureau," she said, her tone cold. "And you've just arrested him on nothing more than a baseless assumption." Tim's hands shook slightly as the realization of what he had done began to fully sink in. He had not only made a massive mistake, he had crossed a line that he couldn't come back from. David looked at Tim, his expression unreadable but full of weight. "You see, Officer Mitchell," he said quietly, "this wasn't just about me being an FBI agent. This is about how you view people who don't look like you. And today, that nearly cost you your job." Tim couldn't speak. His mind was spinning, and his heart felt like it was pounding out of his chest. The arrogance and certainty he had felt earlier had been stripped away, replaced with the cold, hard truth. Bennett turned back to Tim, her voice carrying the final blow. "You're dismissed for now, Officer Mitchell. We'll discuss the next steps later, but know this, you're going to face consequences for what you've done here today." Tim nodded weakly, the words barely registering as he stood up, feeling numb. He glanced at David, who remained calm and composed, then quickly turned and left the room without a word. The door closed softly behind him, but the weight of what had just happened hung in the air like a heavy storm cloud. Tim Mitchell sat at his desk, staring blankly at the clutter of paperwork and half-empty coffee cups in front of him. The precinct buzzed with activity around him, but the usual sounds of phones ringing and officers talking felt distant, almost muted. The words FBI agent kept echoing in his mind, each repetition making the weight of his actions heavier. He had profiled and wrongfully arrested a black man, a man who wasn't just any random person but a high-ranking FBI agent. His career, his reputation, everything he'd worked for, now hung by a thread. The door to Captain Bennett's office opened across the room, and her sharp voice called out, "Officer Mitchell, my office, now." Tim's heart sank. He stood slowly, feeling the eyes of his fellow officers on him. They had heard about what had happened, the whispers spreading through the precinct like wildfire. His legs felt heavy as he made his way to the office, each step carrying him closer to what felt like an inevitable end. He knocked lightly before entering. Captain Bennett sat behind her desk, her expression as cold as stone. Across from her, in the same chair as before, sat David Grant. He looked as composed as ever, though there was an unmistakable tension in the air. "Sit," Bennett commanded, motioning to the chair next to David. Tim obeyed, sitting stiffly. He avoided David's gaze, the shame burning in his chest. Bennett's eyes bore into him, her disappointment palpable. "Officer Mitchell," Bennett began, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" Tim swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Yes, Captain," he mumbled. Bennett leaned forward, her hands folded neatly on her desk. "Let's be clear. You didn't just make a mistake today. You acted on prejudice, assumptions, and racial bias. You profiled Mr. Grant without any just cause and, in doing so, violated not only department policy but the trust we're supposed to have with the community." Tim's pulse quickened, but his voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for it to happen like this." Bennett's gaze hardened. "Intent doesn't change the outcome. You arrested a man who was doing nothing wrong, a man who, as it turns out, holds more authority than you ever imagined. But that's not the point, Officer Mitchell. The point is it could have been anyone, any black man sitting in that park, and your actions would have been the same." Tim's hands tightened into fists in his lap. He had spent years in law enforcement, priding himself on being someone who upheld the law. But now, sitting here, faced with the consequences of his actions, he realized just how deep his biases ran. He had never fully acknowledged them until now. There was a brief silence before David spoke, his voice low but firm. "Officer Mitchell, this isn't just about what happened today. It's about what's been happening for years. I've faced situations like this countless times, even as a federal agent. Do you know how exhausting it is to constantly be seen as a threat, no matter who you are or what you've accomplished?" Tim forced himself to meet David's eyes, the weight of his words sinking in. David continued, his tone steady but filled with purpose. "You didn't see me as a man sitting in a park. You saw me as a black man who didn't belong. That's why you arrested me. That's why we're sitting here now." Tim felt his chest tighten with guilt. He had no defense, No excuse that could justify what he had done. The truth was painfully clear. Tim began, his voice shaking slightly. I didn't realize how wrong I was until it was too late. David leaned back slightly, studying Tim for a moment before speaking again. The thing is, Officer Mitchell, it shouldn't take you realizing I'm an FBI agent to treat me with respect. My position shouldn't be the reason you change your mind about who I am. Tim's eyes fell to the floor, his shame burning through him. He had been so sure of himself, so sure of his instincts, but now he saw just how deeply flawed they were. He had let his biases guide him, and it had led to this, a situation that could have easily spiraled out of control, with far worse consequences. Bennett spoke up again, her voice softening slightly. Officer Mitchell, you have a choice now. You can either reflect on this experience and learn from it, or you can continue down the same path you've been walking. But if you choose the latter, know that there will be no place for you in this department. Tim nodded weakly, his mind reeling. He had never felt so lost, so shaken. I understand, Captain. David stood, his calm demeanor never wavering. I'm not looking to ruin your life, Officer Mitchell, but I do expect you to think long and hard about what happened here today. And I expect you to do better. Tim looked up at David, and for the first time, he truly understood the weight of his actions. This wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger. It was about the way people like David were treated, day in and day out, simply because of the color of their skin. I will, Tim said quietly, his voice filled with regret. I'll do better. David gave a small nod, acknowledging the words but knowing that actions would speak louder. He turned to Captain Bennett. Thank you, Captain. I appreciate how this has been handled. Bennett nodded in return. We'll continue to make sure our department holds itself to the highest standards. With that, David walked out of the office, leaving Tim and Bennett alone. The door clicked softly behind him, the weight of the silence in the room almost unbearable. Bennett let out a slow breath, her eyes softening just slightly. Mitchell, you've been with us a long time. I'm giving you a chance to make this right. But understand, if there's ever a next time, there won't be any more second chances. Tim nodded, his voice barely audible. I understand. Good, Bennett said, her voice firm once more. Take the rest of the day. Reflect on this. We'll talk about your future here tomorrow. Tim stood up slowly, his body feeling heavier than ever. As he left Bennett's office, the realization of what had happened hit him with full force. He had come into work that morning thinking it was just another day, but now everything had changed. He walked out of the precinct, the cool air hitting his face, but it did little to ease the storm of emotions swirling inside him. His career, his identity as a police officer, everything he had taken pride in, now felt uncertain. And for the first time in his career, Tim Mitchell wasn't sure if he deserved to wear the badge anymore. The next morning, Tim Mitchell sat at his kitchen table, staring into his cup of coffee, the steam rising slowly. The world outside his window carried on as usual, the sounds of cars driving by, people walking their dogs, the faint murmur of the city waking up. But for Tim, everything felt different. The events of the previous day weighed heavily on him. His actions, his assumptions, and the stark realization of his own bias were all swirling in his mind, refusing to settle. His phone buzzed on the table, a message from Captain Bennett. Report to the precinct at 9 a.m. We'll discuss next steps then. Tim sighed, rubbing his eyes. He wasn't sure what those next steps would be. He had never felt so unsure about his place in the world, about his identity as a police officer. Everything he had once believed about himself had been shaken to its core. At exactly 9 a.m., Tim walked through the doors of the precinct. The usual buzz of activity greeted him, but there was an undeniable shift in the way people looked at him. Whispers floated through the room, and eyes lingered on him a little longer than they used to. Everyone knew what had happened. Tim could feel their judgment, but worse than that, he could feel his own. He made his way to Captain Bennett's office, his steps heavy, as though the weight of his actions made it hard to walk. He knocked on the door lightly. "Come in," Bennett's voice called. Tim entered, closing the door softly behind him. Captain Bennett sat behind her desk, her expression serious but not unkind. She motioned for him to sit. Tim took the seat across from her, folding his hands in his lap, waiting for her to speak. "We've completed our review of the incident," Bennett began, her tone measured. "And as you can imagine, it's not a decision we've taken lightly." Tim nodded, bracing himself for what was to come. Bennett leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto his. "Officer Mitchell, I won't sugarcoat this. What happened yesterday was unacceptable. You acted on bias, and that led to the wrongful arrest of an innocent man, a man who happens to hold a position of significant authority. But as Mr. Grant himself said, this isn't about his status as an FBI agent. It's about how you view people. It's about the assumptions you made based on race, not behavior." Tim swallowed hard, feeling the knot in his stomach tighten. "I know, Captain," he said quietly. I let my assumptions guide me. I was wrong." Bennett didn't respond right away. She studied him for a moment, weighing her next words carefully. "The department has decided not to terminate your employment this time, but you will be suspended without pay for 3 months. During that time, you'll be required to undergo extensive training on racial bias, de-escalation, and community relations. And when you return, your performance will be under close review. Any further incidents like this, and you'll be permanently removed from the force." Tim let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The suspension was harsh, but it was far better than losing his job entirely. Still, the words stung. Racial bias, community relations. He had prided himself on being a good cop, on serving his community fairly. But now, he had to confront the uncomfortable truth that maybe, all along, he hadn't been as fair as he thought. "I understand, Captain," Tim said, his voice low. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right." Bennett nodded. "I believe you can, Mitchell, but understand that this isn't just about ticking boxes and attending seminars. This is about a fundamental shift in how you think, how you act. It's about changing the way you approach your job, because if you don't, you'll find yourself back in this office, only next time there won't be a second chance." Tim nodded, feeling the gravity of her words settle in. He had been given a lifeline, but it came with conditions he couldn't afford to ignore. Just as Tim was about to stand, there was a knock at the door. Captain Bennett looked up. "Come in." The door opened and David Grant stepped inside. Tim's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected to see him again, not so soon. David gave a nod to Bennett, then turned his attention to Tim. There was no anger in his eyes, no resentment, but there was a seriousness that made Tim shift uncomfortably in his seat. "I asked to come in today," David said, his voice calm and steady, "not to press charges or to push for your termination, but to offer you something." Tim blinked, surprised. "Offer me something?" David nodded, his gaze unwavering. "You made a mistake, a big one, but I believe that people can learn from their mistakes if they're willing to acknowledge them and do the work to change. So I'm offering you a chance to be part of something bigger than just your suspension and training." Tim furrowed his brow, unsure of what David meant. "I work with community outreach programs," David explained. "Programs designed to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the communities they serve. We work with officers like yourself who have made mistakes, to help them understand the impact of their actions and to rebuild trust with the people they've wronged. It's hard work, but it's important work, and it's something I think you could benefit from." Tim felt a lump rise in his throat. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected anything other than punishment. But now, here was the man he had wrongfully arrested, offering him a chance to make amends, to grow. I don't know what to say, Tim stammered, caught off guard by the gesture. David gave a small, knowing smile. You don't have to say anything right now. Just think about it. If you're serious about doing better, this is a place to start. Tim nodded, his voice barely audible. Thank you. David turned to Captain Bennett. I'll be in touch with the details. Bennett nodded, her expression softening slightly. Thank you, Mr. Grant. David gave Tim one last look, a look that carried both expectation and understanding, before he turned and left the office, the door closing softly behind him. Tim sat there for a moment, his mind racing. He had been given a second chance. More than that, he had been given an opportunity to truly make a difference, to not only change himself, but to help others in the process. Captain Bennett stood, signaling the end of the conversation. You've got a lot of work ahead of you, Mitchell. Don't waste this chance. Tim nodded, standing slowly. I won't, Captain. As he left the office, the weight of his actions still hung over him, but for the first time it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a responsibility to make things right, not just for himself, but for every person like David Grant who had been judged unfairly. He had a long road ahead of him, but for the first time in a long time, Tim Mitchell was ready to walk it.